I am now pleased to introduce Dr. Deirdre Klokow to you. We are already kind of old acquaintances through the Seleukid lecture series. Deirdre has been working with us nearly since the very beginning, and then our cooperation got even much closer when we produced Seleukid Perspectives 1, Seleukid Ideology. And while we were doing all this work together, Deirdre was finishing and then defending her PhD at the University of California, and also took on the position as an assistant professor at the University of Austin, Texas. And that was already 1.5 years ago. So right now she is continuing to work on her PhD thesis under the title The Seleucids and Their Land. But another topic that concerns Deirdre very much is the role and the agency of Hellenistic royal women. Today, she is going to present Ideology and or in Praxis, Directions in the Study of Seleukid Ideology. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you for the introduction and for inviting me to come here and speak today. And thanks to Altay and Rolf for putting this workshop together. It's always such a pleasure to get to see more people working in the Hellenistic world. I'm lucky in my department to have one other Hellenistic person, but it's not that often, that we get to have a group together. So it's great to see you all, and it's a pleasure to be joining you from Texas. Okay, so the study of Seleukid kingship, as indeed the study of Hellenistic kingship writ large, has in general been approached from two perspectives: ideology and praxis, the ideal and the practical. And given the nature of our extant evidence with its elite and often literary contexts, it's really not surprising that it is the ideal, the ideological aspect that has often been given the emphasis, although both are necessary components of kingship and rule. The issue for us as scholars is to hold both aspects, ideology and praxis, the ideal and the practical, in our gaze at the same time in order to reconstruct a holistic history that reflects the complex and often predatory nature of the Seleukid state. Following a short introductory example, I'm going to turn to some recent scholarship on the subject of Seleukid ideology, considering how the focus on the self-representation of the state, its idealized self-image, might exist in a dialectic and even contentious relationship with the realities of a colonial extractive state. And finally, I'll take a very brief look at a model for Hellenistic kingship and what it might have to teach us about the tensions and intersections between the ideal and the practical aspects of Seleukid rule. So I'm going to preface this all by saying that it is the intention of this paper not to present all of the fine-grained details of the arguments and examples with which I'm engaging here, but instead to extrapolate from a survey of wider trends, some avenues and directions by which we might approach royal ideology, not as a single driver of structures and behaviors, but as a specific and contingent aspect of a wider political ecosystem, an extensive network of power relations driven by ancient and evolving expectations and demands. And I argue that it is important that we understand ideology not simply as a framework for modern analysis or a vessel for royal self-expression, but as an integral aspect of the Seleukid worldview, evolving with it and constrained by the same socio-economic pressures as the populations, society, and environments over which it ruled. So I'd like to begin with a brief definition of ideology and praxis as they pertain to my discussion here today. Ideology, to borrow from Stuart Hall's 1996 definition, consists of the mental and imagined frameworks, whether these are languages, categories, images, or otherwise, that different groups use to make sense of, and render legible a society or a state. The frameworks of ideology themselves are introduced and reinforced by the material, political, and socio-economic systems that make up the praxis of royal or imperial rule. Those same practical systems, in turn, rely on the narratives of ideology to render an image of empire they create both natural and beneficent, maybe even eternal, to the populations under their dominion. In this sense, the practicalities of rule can be understood as fundamentally ideological in nature, as the complex and often very messy relationships between royal control and the agency and resilience of local communities relies on the coherence, benevolence, and inevitability ideological systems are able to project. So, an example before I get into the survey of recent literature. In 148 BCE, on the cliff face at Behistun in modern-day Iran, one Hyacinthos, son of Pentalkos, had an image carved of the hero Heracles, who is shown in the relief, reclining in the act of drinking, with his lion skin, club, and his arms, his weapons, cast aside. The accompanying Greek inscription tells the viewer that the image was created as a dedication for the well-being of Cleomenes, the commander in charge of the upper satrapies. The monument encapsulates for the viewer these twin aspects of the state that I have begun by discussing. We have the image of Heracles himself, one of the divine ancestors claimed by the Seleukid dynasty, and a figure who is deeply embedded, particularly within early narratives of Seleukid self-presentations. There is also the moment in which the image captures Heracles. He's lounging, drink in hand, a voluptuous moment of indulgence and pleasure that is well in accord with the famous luxury of the royal house. A moment that is in tension with the alert forward gaze of the hero who looks out at the viewer and is suggestive of an awareness and engagement with his surroundings despite the indolence of his pose. We should note also the careful inclusion within this relief of the tools of violence that are as central to the image of Heracles as to the aggressively militaristic ideal of Seleukid and indeed Hellenistic kingship. So I'm talking here about the hero's club and his bow and arrows, which are carefully depicted right next to him. The epithet that's accorded to Heracles in the text, Kalinikos, is one that is used traditionally both for Heracles himself and for certain of the Seleukid kings, evoking their shared characteristics of protective violence, charisma, and a core civilizing force. But the Behistun image functions on another level as well, as representative of the administrative state that underpins such a monument and makes possible its ideological expression. At its simplest, the image marks a clearly transactional relationship between different participants in the Seleukid state. We have Cleomenes, the man in charge of the upper satrapies, so the provinces east of Babylonia, modern-day Iran and Afghanistan, and Hyacinthos, son of Pentalkos, the dedicator of the monument, and perhaps a local administrative official or military commander of the region around Behistun. A dedication of an image of Heracles would be perhaps particularly appropriate from a military figure. The text itself is dated to the year 164, month of Panemos. So we are in the Seleukid era, the continuous reckoning of time instituted likely by Antiochus I as a reaction to the pressures of the early Hellenistic period. The location of the monument at Behistun, not far from the famous massive trilingual inscription and relief of Darius I, one of the early founders of the Achaemenid Empire, not only ties the Seleukid monument to the continuum of imperial power already present at Behistun, but also highlights the strategic significance of the military district, the Phylake, of Behistun, with its important east-west land route through the province of Media, itself dominated and controlled by the presence of multiple Seleukid military colonies. We can consider here the resources of time, money, and labor that Hyacinthos was able to draw on to create this monument for Cleomenes, a religious and honorific attestation to the dominion of the Seleukid military and administrative presence, ironically made at a time of deep threat to the stability of that state. In 148 BC, the upper satrapies, of which Cleomenes is being referred to as strategos of, are largely slipping out of Seleukid control, and the twin threats of Parthia in the east and Rome in the west are beginning to grind Seleukid authority like so much grist in the mill. I'd like to turn now to consider two recent volumes on Seleukid ideology. The volume by Eva Adagnostou Lautides and Stefan Pfeiffer from 2022, Culture and Ideology Under the Seleukids, Unframing a Dynasty, and the 2023 volume by Altay and Richard Wanghofer, Seleukid Ideology, Creation, Reception, and Response. I present this brief discussion of these two volumes with the caveat that the great fluorescence in Seleukid scholarship over the past decade and more makes anything like a comprehensive overview not just unwieldy, but possibly impossible. These two volumes were chosen for the similarity of their aims as much as the recent date of their publication. And with a sliver of shameless self-promotion here, as Altay mentioned, I contributed a chapter to his volume and worked as the administrative assistant, just laying that out there. Reviewing each of these volumes in preparation for this paper, I was struck by the range and diversity of approaches and material covered, so much so that I can only offer a brief summation of their themes today. Both volumes, at their core, stress the hybridity and diversity of the empire and the deep importance of a holistic perspective to the varied methodological approaches. They incorporate different linguistic analyses, sociological and political frameworks, and comparative models, just for a start. Neither attempts to impose a theoretical or methodological unity on its contributors. In fact, each encourages a diversity that mirrors the much vaunted chameleon-like kingship of the Seleukids and the Near East in general. Although I have myself written and talked about the strength of that essential plasticity of Seleukid rule and certainly applaud the variety of approaches within these volumes, particularly when it comes to highlighting non-English language contributions, I wonder if this emphasis on diversity and adaptation is not keeping us from addressing the reality of the Seleukid state as an exogenous colonial structure imposed upon and benefiting from a natural and human landscape to which its claims remained tenuous and imaginary, a profound lack of legitimacy that lies behind and necessitates both the elaboration of a complex ideology and the practical imposition of military force and bureaucratic control. Both volumes have their origins in public presentations on the Seleukids, the Culture and Ideology volume growing from a subject conference in Sydney in 2019, and the Seleukid Ideology volume representing output from the Seleukid Study Days, as well as the Seleukid Lecture Series that arose as a welcome network connecting Seleukid researchers during the COVID-19 pandemic, which I'm sure we all vividly remember. Each investigates the conception, development, and local adaptation of Seleukid royal ideology, emphasizing the need of the dynasty to construct a narrative to justify the formation of the Seleukid state, its ability to adapt itself to local needs and expectations, and the impacts on Seleukid ideology created by relations between the Seleukids and other regional peers, such as Rome and Ptolemaic Egypt. These volumes are perhaps at their most successful when considering these kinds of adaptations, which reflect a flexibility and awareness that hint at a deep penetration of state bureaucracy within the social and religious structures of subject communities. Sorry, I've been talking a lot this week and my voice is slightly shredded. This often takes the form of discussions of resistance to Seleukid rule. Contributions consider the decay of Seleukid authority in Asia Minor, as resulting from the need to acknowledge and incorporate local centers of power in the region. This is Paul McKechnie on the War of the Brothers and shifting power dynamics between the Seleucids and elites of Judea, moving from cooperation with Seleukid narratives of control to the adoption and adaptation of that very language and structure of power to legitimize the emerging Hasmonean state. And this is Altay's chapter on reception of Seleukid ideology in 2nd century Judea. Richard Wengofer takes a broader perspective on this subject by framing the reception and engagement of Seleukid communities, of subject communities with the Seleucids as dependent on the level of coercion with which they are met, suggesting that the Seleucids were not often able to maintain the balance between control and oppression. This is Wengofer's popular resistance to Seleukid claims to hegemony. The response of local communities to the pressures of the Hellenistic states, and in particular the demands made upon local communities by the bureaucratic systems put in place to facilitate revenue extraction, which of course is then largely funneled into the military machines that drove the Hellenistic states and were in so many ways the core of their existence and their meaning, their raison d'etre, represents a growing area of Seleukid studies. The development and implementation of the imperial bureaucracy, a core component of the extractive state and visible, just to take one category, in engagement with the religious and civic administrations of local communities, deserves more emphasis as a key connector between local and royal systems, as well as a key facet through which subject populations engage with or resist the demands of the state. And shameless self-promotion again, we can consider here my own contribution to the 2023 volume, which deals with the presence of state bureaucracy in Asia Minor through the Panacome dossier and in Babylonia through the layman text, evaluating responses and adaptations on the local and royal level to increases in the administrative presence in these regions. A central component of the study of Seleukid ideology is perhaps to question the purpose of the state itself. What did Seleukid kingship exist for? And how did these ideological narratives and images it presented of itself further extend these purposes? We have become adept at considering this in terms particularly of the early stages of the dynasty, when narratives of power and legitimacy were in the process of development. We can consider here Kyle Erickson's chapter on the development of the Seleukid mythos through and around the person of Seleucus I, and Eva Anagnostou Autide's analysis of the Seleukid symbol of the anchor, which she ably situates within the larger context of Near Eastern paradigms and symbols of royal power. We have, however, as a field, perhaps been rather less focused on the dissemination of royal ideology in the later stages of the Seleukid state, which is maybe hardly surprising given the chaos amidst which the later Seleucids function. It is perhaps in periods of transition and decay, however, that we see the narratives and networks of power laid most bare. A core exception to this later Seleukid model continues to be the Daphne procession in 166, investigated by Babette Edelman-Singer and Stephen Harrison from the perspectives of both localized expectations and of the tensions between cultural and territorial boundaries and conceptions of universal rule. Conversations on the later phases of Seleukid rule tend, however, to be driven by reception studies in local and peripheral states, as well as in contributions that focus on threads of what might be considered Seleukid propaganda or court narratives, in, for example, the narratives presented in the books of Esther and David, and the layered narratives of authors like Polybius, grappling with multiple different sources of Seleukid and Ptolemaic and other networks of power. These narratives can be further developed by focusing on what remains of the Seleukid state, even among its disintegrated state. The invitation in the 1st century BC by the citizens of Antioch to Tigranes II of Armenia to claim the Seleukid throne rather than allow the kingship to fall into abeyance. This is in Justin 41, 1, I think. And the similar action by the citizens of Damascus, deciding to call the Nabatean king Aretas III to rule them after the death of Antiochus XII. This is in Josephus. Tells us how deeply embedded Seleukid royal systems had become within the stability and self-presentation of the regions, despite the long history of dynastic upheaval that had preceded it. You'd think after all the chaos that these cities would be really, really happy to shed the Seleukid shackles. I did mean Daniel, yes, sorry. It's early here in Texas. Okay, within these volumes lies one more trend on which I would like to focus further here, which is the broadening perspective on Seleukid rulership beyond simply the royal persona of the king himself. And we see this most explicitly in Alex Macaulay's discussion of the Seleukid reigning triad in his chapter in the 2022 volume titled The Seleukid Royal Family as a Reigning Triad, which articulates Seleukid rule as this uniquely family affair, presenting a universally relatable conception of the family unit that could cross cultural boundaries within a diverse empire, a reaction to the essential pluralism of the Seleukid state. And we see this familiar power basis of this sort of familial model articulated, of course, in very broad strokes in the cities of the Syrian Tetrapolis, Antiocheia, Laodicea, Apamea. The significance of the three possibly underscored and tied together with the dynastic Seleucia. And in the language of the Antiochus cylinder, which groups Antiochus I, his wife Stratonike, and their son Seleucus together, correlating the three core actors with divine Greek and Babylonian counterparts. Macaulay is quite right to note that this is indeed a deliberate narrowing of the public face of the dynasty to only its core members, perhaps not just in an attempt to emphasize continuity between generations, but also to simplify and to increase the public legibility of the ruling family. Consideration of the reigning triad as a core aspect of the Seleukid dynasty is not a new concept, of course. This refined image of the royal family is crucial to the cultivation of dynastic coherence and generational stability, particularly in the early years of the dynasty, when the spectacular implosion of the Argead dynasty is still a prominent example and narrative. But of course, along with the narrative of familial unity presented by the reigning triad model, it likewise presents a broader base of significance and agency for royal actors beyond the king himself. We see this, of course, most clearly in Ptolemaic Egypt, where the creation of an ideological face for the dynasty that is centered on a royal couple provides an early basis for the development of the social, religious, and economic authority of royal women, which culminates in the final years of the dynasty. This development is, of course, not nearly as present or as clear in all regions under Seleukid rule, but we do see Seleukid royal women acting as agents and vehicles of royal power in different guises throughout these volumes, balancing the more roving, mobile, militaristic figure of the Seleukid king with their more stationary Aulic models, and occasionally with their closer and more deeply intertwined relationships with certain civic communities. Altay's chapter, The First Seleukid Benefactions in Miletos and the Creation of a Dynastic Ideology, makes use of the epigraphic evidence from Didyma to consider how the citizens of Miletos sought a relationship with Seleukid authority, not simply through the person of the king, but through the ruling structure of king, queen, and royal heir. This exploration helps us to extend our discussion, which is so often framed in terms of the diversity with which Seleukid kings contend in addressing their own subjects, out into the complexities of the royal family and the dynamics of the wider royal court with which subject polities had to engage themselves. As Coskun also notes, the Milesian dossier provides us with an early and unique glimpse at Apama, wife of Seleukid, who together with her son Antiochus is honored by the Milesians, although he does express doubt concerning the agency and involvement of Apama in the political negotiations here, noting in particular that honors for Apama are always couched within honors for her husband Seleukid and her son Antiochus. And whether or not the vagueness of the epigraphic text does indeed express a lack of engagement between the Seleukid Basilissa and the Milesians, it's clear that her presence is an expected and perhaps necessary aspect of the ruling authority here. Still, Apama's historical and ideological significance is perhaps elaborated in the unfortunately now lost mosaics from Apamea, one section of which shows a figure interpreted as Apama as an early benefactor of the city. We can perhaps consider or contextualize the importance of Apama's presence together with the economic agency of Laodicea, first in Asia Minor and Babylon, which I discussed earlier, and which demonstrates clearly the circle of administrators and economic officials around Laodicea in language that suggests the normalcy of such an entourage for a royal woman. Similarly, although not discussed in the volumes that I'm talking about today, is the political and economic agency of the Ptolemaic princess, turned Seleukid dynastic figure, Cleopatra Thea, whom Josephus records as summoning the Seleukid princeling Antiochus Sidetes to marry her and to assume the Seleukid throne on the advice of her own Philoi, suggesting as well that the Seleukid soldiers in Seleucia preferred Cleopatra's authority to that of the usurper Diodotus. Taken together, the examples indicate a broader base for Seleukid administration and authority than just the figure of the king himself, however much he may lay at the center of the presentation of royal ideology. A final thread I'd like to pull on from these volumes concerns the representation of Seleukid authority as benefactor, which lies in many ways at the heart of our conception of royal ideology, particularly for those of us coming from the Greek tradition. Whether we consider it from the perspective of communities soliciting and engaging with Seleukid benefactions, or from the idea of their rejection of the deeper penetration of the state within their communities that is a necessary factor and result of the euergistic relationship. The very public agency of the Greek poleis in the Seleukid state, discussed, for example, by Gillian Ramsey, reminds us of the hierarchical nature of not only royal ideology, but the functioning of the Hellenistic states writ large, the complex realities of long-enduring systems of civic autonomy, to whatever degree it in fact existed, necessitated complex ideological presentations of interaction and exchange. The representations of this exchange found in the familiar Greek evidence often blinds us to the power dynamic as it extends beyond the polis into what we might consider the chora, the territory in which existed many of the non-Greek cities and communities, the temples and religious localities, and the widespread rural communities, all paying tribute, subject to some degree to royal taxation, in addition to the predatory behavior such as corvée labor and the forced garrisoning of Seleukid troops. The complexities and variations of Seleukid hegemony are less visible in the idealized, even possibly flattening discourse of ideological presentation, and require a different lens through which to examine the layers of administrative control and local reactions to it. I've attempted here, through the medium of this survey, recent literature, to demonstrate the intersections between the dual axes of ruling power, the ideology, and the practice of royal rule. The Seleukid Basilissa can be described at its, Basileia, not Basilissa, can be described at its simplest level as a group of institutions, the practices, bodies, and structures that provide the apparatus for the exercise of control. Institutions tending, perhaps necessarily, towards adaptability and even fragmentation, which are overlain then by the idealizing and coherent narratives of dynastic self-representation. The functions of the administration, as I said before, are perhaps as much ideological as they are practical in nature. the image projected of an idealized state that is pervasive, omniscient, effective, and above all, natural, is as essential to the cultivation or appearance of stability as it is to the workings of the extractive state upon which and for which the entire imperial project rested. Populations of the empire interact with both the details of the administrative state and the idea of the king or the royal image. Negotiations of power take place on both levels, often simultaneously. The Behistun monument with which I began this paper functions on these many levels. The reclining Heracles is emblematic of the latent power of the Seleukid state, made more potent by its embedding within a long regional landscape of royal rule. Heracles, the great wanderer, the famous civilizer, rests at ease as beneath his gaze the military and administrative force of the Seleukid must have passed along that east-west artery through the plain. I'd like to consider here the well-known, possibly somewhat time-worn, definition of Hellenistic kingship given by the Suda, the 10th century Byzantine compilation that defines Basileia in the period following Alexander as deriving neither from descent, phosis, nor from legal legitimacy, decay, but from the ability to command an army and to rule effectively. But this is not the end of the definitions that the Suda provides. The next entry continues the discussion of Basileia with the claim that because kingship necessitates the possession of the common things, ktema ton koinon, but the public things, ta demousia ktemata, do not belong to the kingship, it is necessary, therefore, to detest as the excesses of a tyrant royal interventions made with force and arrogance, but to honor, like a solemn duty, requests for contributions that are made persuasively and with care. Both entries of the Suda contain the same distinction between military force, the violent capacity of the state, and administrative capacity, the negotiated relationships between state and subject polis. More to the point of this paper, however, each entry seems to revolve around a similar fulcrum, the distinction between the affairs of kingship and the affairs of the people, between public and private, between the imposition of power and the performance of legitimacy and benevolence, between perhaps the praxis of the state and its ideology. Ideology is, after all, not simply about legitimacy or the justification for imperial rule, but exists to provide the larger framework for the interaction of local and regional actors with the existence of the state itself. I'd like to close here by just widening my gaze somewhat beyond the Seleukid state to note something that's been of particular concern here lately. I think that no one who has been watching events unfold recently, particularly here in the United States, but also I think on the European stage and even globally, could argue that ideology plays only an insignificant role in the shape, not just of social and political discourse, but in the practical unfolding of day-to-day life. It is at the core of the taxes that we pay, the wars that we fight and those that we permit, and the rights that we keep or lose or accord to different groups under different iterations of government. And this was as true under the Seleukid kings as it is today under the growing shift in political systems. And it behooves us each to take note of the unfolding and intersections of both ideology and practical applications, both in the distant past and in the very quickly approaching present. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Deirdre. That was a lot for us to think about. I wonder if anyone wants to respond quite quickly. I've been quite humbled by your final thoughts, and yeah.
Sorry to take it to the dark political place.
No. And but it is so important and so obvious to emphasize and tease out ideology matters. It matters for every single one of us for our lives. Ben, your hand went up.
Yeah, a couple of things. First of all, thank you very much. You have given us a lot to think about. Let's say you have a blank blackboard or whiteboard or something, and we talk about what is Seleukid ideology. I think if I'm understanding you correctly, you're saying it's not just dynastic power. It's not just the stability, but that there are other things involved. What other words would you write on that blackboard to define Seleukid ideology?
Wow, that's a really good question. I feel like that's a great teaching question. Yes, I mean, I think, we're used to thinking about ideology in terms of justification and legitimacy. But I think one of the things that's very important for Seleukid ideology has to do with maybe coherence and legibility, the ability to make the state something that people um, are able to interact with and engage with, that enables the state to penetrate more clearly into local systems. And I think also there's a level of Seleukid ideology that is about um, trying to encourage that kind of participation, right? To make the state something that is benevolent. We see this with, for instance, a lot of economic systems where the Seleucid kings are engaging themselves with, for instance, the Greek cities in Asia Minor as this sort of benevolent figure, but there's always the sense of the sort of steel fist inside of that velvet glove, right? So I think it's also this idea of overarching benevolence that I would also add to the definition. But I'd be very interested to hear how anyone else would define that.
Would you put on in tolerance, religious tolerance? Would you put in the attempt in terms of religious stuff towards harmonization and synthesis?
I think that's a tricky question. I often wonder if religious tolerance is something that applies in the way that we think about it today to the sort of pre-Christian period. Certainly, I mean, I think if you mean tolerance in the sense of engagement, if you mean tolerance in the sense of willingness to sort of adopt a plastic representation of monarchy within different religious systems, sure.
What about benefaction of other religious systems? What about the attempt to synthesize, say, I don't know, Apollo with another god, or a harmonization, synthesis, something like that? Is that
I am not sure about that. I was interested in the previous discussion about what do we care what the Greeks think, right? Because we have always this focus on making sure that everything that Seleucids do in the Near East is applicable to all of these different groups, and especially to the Greeks, right? We have this constant focus on syncretism and on mass appeal. And I'm just not sure that is at the core of the ideological representation that we see. I think some of that is us possibly projecting slightly, if that makes sense.
You don't feel like the Seleucids were saying, look, we're going to rule over you. You can do your thing. We're going to sort of connect our thing with your thing. You don't think that was part of
definitely. Sorry, okay. I'm reading too much into this term, like tolerance, right? Yes, definitely. I mean, definitely engaging in that, but I think possibly we press that a bit far.
It is all right. Maybe tolerance is a monotheistic kind of word.
Okay. Sorry to quibble.
Okay, so I still have one of the things, in the discussion between Richard and Altay that has always struck me is that they're both right. Okay. But also, and I want to know if you would agree with this, that they could both be right in terms, like you had some wonderful sentence towards the beginning about the tenuousness of the colonialist paradigm and that there was always resistance. I don't remember your sentence, but it was something very nice like that. Isn't it possible that at any given moment, in any given city, you had two factions of people, one who were the Tories and the Loyalists, and the other who wanted to rebel if you gave them any excuse to?
Yes, I mean, I think this is the problem that I find when we approach the ancient past with this ideological lens, right? Is that we're at risk of flattening all of the different ways that people can interact with a state, right? you might hypothetically find that someone has a sweeping majority, I don't know, in politics, but that doesn't necessarily represent all of the ways that different communities and different people are interacting with those systems, right? So there's absolutely room for different levels of agreement and disagreement and a range of responses. I feel like that's not really getting to the heart of your question, though.
No, I think it is. I think you're appreciating that at any given moment there are a lot of things going on, and also that in 4 years we could throw out a dictator. Well, there's all sorts of things.
Hope springs eternal, right? But yes, I mean, I think that is one of the wonderful things that came out of, I think, these two volumes, is that we can sort of model this plasticity and this adaptability ourselves in the different approaches that we take to understanding different systems, instead of sort of assuming that because the Greek cities are putting up inscriptions praising the king, that everybody must necessarily therefore be on board with these systems, right? And there are different hierarchical systems and social systems at play beneath that language.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Otherwise, I would have some comments of my own while you are thinking, not wasting time. So just to contribute to the question about tolerance versus intolerance, and there was a time when I started studying the ancient world, I thought tolerance must have been ingrained in the recipe book for a successful empire. But when I worked my way through antiquity and ended with late antiquity, I have now come to believe that Christianity is not the main factor for the disintegration of the later Roman Empire. There are multiple reasons, but in certain ways, even a monotheistic religion with a lot of intolerance could actually lead to strength. And we see that even more with the rise of the Islamic empires, the enormous dynamic. So I think it's very ambiguous. It's very ambiguous, and you were quite cautious with your response in this regard. You can't imagine a dynamic, an imperial dynamic that is very polytheistic, very, very tolerant, inclusive, indifferent. Bickerman actually made that very clear. It's often indifference that is a very helpful ingredient in the imperial pie. So that's the one thing. The other thing is, of course, I did take note that you framed your very thoughtful presentation at the beginning and at the end with references to colonialism and colonial exploitation. So the emphasis at the beginning was on violence and resource extraction. And you did return to some of these notions towards the end, where you contrasted it with the ideology of the benefaction of euergesia, which is quite an interesting thing, that the one who takes a lot and returns a little bit is then the great benefactor. And yes, it did remind me also of my ongoing conversation with Richard Wenghofer on well, how much did ideology actually do, how much was believed, and how much was just had to be accepted because of the power asymmetry. So how should we re-articulate the question from a particularly colonial perspective? And let me take the non-fashionable side of kind of, being apologetic. Is it not overstated or is it not a distortion to believe that people in any normal society are free and the majority of people have access to their own resources? And does it matter so much if the neighbor sitting right on the other chair beside me is taking the lion's share, or someone further down this table or another room, or so the anti-colonial also ideology somehow seems to be taking for granted that if we get rid of one colonial exploiter or one one exploiter, one tyrant, then we have the ideal situation, and we have freedom and equality and so on. And I just do not believe this. And when I studied Seleukid ideology, amongst others, I found so much support coming from amongst the people. And when I am in monarchical societies, when I glance over at the United Kingdom, or now here in the Netherlands, even though the royal couple or royal family is not as present, I feel as it is in the United Kingdom. There are so many loyalists that seem to be belying the idea that every human by nature is aiming for freedom and kind of a democracy, autonomy. So what would you respond to this?
Big questions, Altay. So I first want to return to what you said about the importance of thinking about maybe indifference instead of tolerance, which I think is a very important aspect of this discussion. When we think about how Seleukid ideology is interacting with different systems, right? There's a level of just tolerance, I think, is not the right model. And I think this is a similar perspective to the one I take on the question that you're asking about the model of freedom and autonomy and the desire that people may or may not have to rid themselves of, oppressive state systems, right? Or to even view state systems as oppressive. And I think one of the things that I'm very interested in, the book that I'm writing deals with the institutions of the state, the bureaucracy and administration, and economic systems. And I think one of the things that helps us to really penetrate and understand the permutations of the state is to get away from these kinds of value judgments. So assuming that because a state is oppressive in a certain level, in the sense that every state that taxes and extracts resources and imposes military control is sort of oppressive, assuming that people are therefore necessarily looking for an option for sort of the imposition of personal liberty out from under the state. I think this is a false model, in the same way that previous models for Seleukid studies that focused on strength versus weakness were imposing a value judgment that tended to overimpose specific models of thinking. Maybe the Seleukids were oppressive. Probably they were in lots of ways. Maybe lots of people wanted to be free. Maybe half of them didn't. Maybe some of them liked the imposition of the state, in the same way that many people like the people that rule them, right? And are happy and comfortable with those systems. I don't think we can make that kind of blanket judgment, but I do think that understanding the purpose of a state, which exists to be extractive, which exists to uphold its own ruling class and to uphold its own elite power structure, to understand and to embed our understanding within a sort of narrative of inequality helps us to understand the spread of the state better, in a way that's not necessarily embedded in value judgments per se. But I'm feeling very bleak about freedom and autonomy currently. So ask me again in 4 years and I might have a different answer.
Yes, well, that I think will be an ongoing dialogue that we're going to have. Any other questions or comments? I'm looking around at this table, or I'm also asking our virtual participants. Feel free to ask.
I have a comment. If I might.
Yes, Susan, please.
Yes. I've been doing a lot of thought on peasants and peoples out in, say, Bactria or some small hamlet in the middle of nowhere. And I often wonder if we don't put our ideas and our thoughts about our leaders or personally our lack thereof, in context to what they were feeling back then. I'm not sure that if have 2 cows and, you know, a goat, and I have 12 children, that I'm really caring about those kinds of things. I tend to think more that maybe someone living in, you know, Antioch or a city might have feelings about who's ruling them rather than the whole populace of an empire. I just, you know, and I think that goes through all the ages. The medieval people certainly had their thoughts more at the real core of where they live, not that, you know, some great king was out there controlling things. I think they had a more very localized view of their king and those around them. I'm not even sure if they would even know that there was a new king. I just,
I agree.
right?
Yes.
I question that.
Yes.
I don't know that
I
they
do too.
cared.
I do too. And I think, you know, this is one of the reasons why I wanted to sort of question the focus on ideology as opposed to the focus on the practical application of the state, right? Because if you've got 2 cows and your chickens and your 12 kids, maybe you don't care if it's Antiochus or Seleucus, and maybe part of that's embedded in this presentation of eternity, right? It's always an Antiochus or a Seleucus or somebody like that on the throne, right? And it doesn't really matter. And the state is unchanging and uncaring and indifferent again. But there are probably things that you do care about. And if the status of the land that you keep that cow on is shifting as elites are coming and going and possessing and selling and changing the status of that land and changing the kind of taxes that are owed or the tribute that's taken from that, there are moments, I think, when that is going to impact every actor to a certain degree. But I think this is one of the reasons why it's helpful to take a really broad chronological view at times, because rural spaces change more slowly, right? And we need to be cognizant of that instead of always focusing on the abrupt changes that we see in these kinds of elite narratives.
Thank you.
Yeah, you know.
Thank you, Susan, also for your comment that added, I think, an important aspect, not just the time dimension, but also the land dimension. And one could actually relate this back also to the recent elections, seeing how different perspectives are in the countryside from the civic or the urban perspectives. So that's good to keep in mind. And well, having heard the keyword land reminds me that I wanted to once again wish you good luck for your book project, The Seleukids and Their Land. When I now thank you again with everyone else in the room.
Thank you very much. I also have to duck out, unfortunately. I'd love to stay and hear everybody else, but I am in a rush to go and teach on the Roman provinces this morning. So unfortunately, I can't stay.
Very fitting, very important. Thank you again.
Thank you.